The Shroud of Turin. A fire and water damaged linen cloth that's been venerated for centuries as the true burial shroud of Jesus Christ. It gained worldwide attention in 1898 when it was photographed for the first time. The publication of the photographic negatives caused an immediate sensation. These negatives highlighted the faint markings on the cloth to reveal a strikingly clear image of a man that many believed to be Jesus himself. But could this really be a true relic from the burial of Christ? According to historical records, it's been in Turin since 1578 AD, and before that it was in Liéry in France. But it can only be traced back as far as 1353, when it came into the possession of a French knight, Geoffroy de Charny. This was a period when there was a lucrative trade in sacred relics throughout Europe, and the absence of any record of how de Charny acquired the shroud has prompted many to believe it to be a clever forgery created in those times to profit from this trade. In 1978, a multidisciplinary team of 40 scientific experts known as the Shroud of Turin Research Project were given access to the shroud for 5 days to study and analyse how the image had been formed. They collected samples from the surface of the cloth using sticky tape and took numerous visual, ultraviolet and X-ray photographs. Their analysis of these samples and images led to some remarkable findings which appeared to confirm the authenticity of the relic. However, their research was completely overshadowed by a radiocarbon dating test performed in 1988. This test attracted a blaze of publicity and concluded that the cloth was not from the time of Jesus Christ, but dated instead to the period 1260 to 1390 AD, a result which tested the faith of many around the world. It seemed that the debate over its authenticity was now over. Indeed, in the years since that test, the Catholic Church has never openly disputed the result of the radiocarbon dating, and even its popes now refer to the cloth as an icon rather than a sacred relic. But should we dismiss the possibility that this is the true burial cloth of Jesus on the basis of this one scientific test? After all, according to archaeologist Eugenia Nitovsky,
in archaeology, if there are 10 lines of evidence, carbon dating being one of them, and it conflicts with the other 9, there is little hesitation to throw out the carbon date as inaccurate due to unforeseen contamination.
So let's take a look at some of the other lines of research concerning the shroud which provide evidence of when and where it originated. I'll begin with the shroud fabric itself, which bears a number of characteristics that suggest a connection with 1st century Palestine. It's a hand-spun linen fabric, woven from flax in herringbone twill, and the resulting cloth is of a very fine quality with a density of about 89 threads per inch. The fine quality of this fabric is consistent with the biblical statement that the shroud was bought by Joseph of Arimathea, a wealthy man. Traces of entwisted cotton fibres, believed to come from some previous work of the same loom, have been found in the woven flax. This cotton is Gossypium herbaceum, a Middle Eastern species not found in Europe. Indeed, cotton wasn't cultivated in Europe during medieval times, and we know that linen cloths of this quality were also very rare. Finally, the cloth itself has dimensions of 14 foot 4 inches by 3 foot 7, which we now know equates to exactly 8 by 2 Assyrian cubits, the unit of measure used in Palestine during the 1st century. These characteristics make it unlikely that the shroud originated in medieval Europe, but they do, however, fit well with the biblical account of its origin. Although the historical record of the shroud only goes back as far as 1353, a 12th century Hungarian manuscript known as the Prayer Codex includes illustrations of the burial of Jesus which correspond with features on the shroud. Jesus is entirely naked, with his arms crossed on the pelvis and thumbs retracted. The fabric has the same herringbone pattern that we see on the shroud. And there are also 4 tiny circles tracing a letter L which match 4 scorch marks seen on the Turin shroud. These matching features indicate that whoever painted the Prayer Codex images must have copied them from the shroud itself. We know that the Prayer Codex was produced in 1192 AD, which means that the shroud must have existed before that date, significantly earlier than the 1260 to 1390 AD dating given by the radiocarbon tests. In 2005, the distinguished American chemist Ray Rogers published a paper in the Thermochemica Acta journal in which he showed an alternative way to estimate the age of linen. It involved a simple chemical test for lignin, the substance which gives cell walls of plants their rigidity. Vanillin is produced by lignin, and it's vanillin that the test detects. Lignin slowly loses its vanillin over time, and Rogers and his colleagues calculated that if the age of the shroud was around 700 years old, as suggested by the radiocarbon tests, it should retain roughly 37% of its vanillin. After 1300 years, only 5% of its vanillin would have been present. He examined shroud fibres, and although he found patches of lignin when examining them under a microscope, there was no trace of vanillin. He obtained similar results when testing samples of linen that were found with the 2,000-year-old Dead Sea Scrolls. But in contrast, samples of medieval linen all showed the presence of vanillin, just as his calculations had predicted. On the basis of these tests, Rogers concluded that the shroud must be at least 1,300 years old, which is more than 600 years older than the radiocarbon date. There's another historical relic which links to the shroud and places it even further back in history. A garment called the Sudarium of Oviedo in Spain has been revered for centuries as the cloth used to cover the face of Jesus after he died on the cross. It's mentioned in the Gospel of John.
Peter therefore went forth, and that other disciple, and came to the sepulchre. So they ran both together. And the other disciple did outrun Peter, and came first to the sepulchre. And he, stooping down and looking in, saw the linen clothes lying, yet went he not in. Then cometh Simon Peter following him, and went into the sepulchre, and seeth the linen clothes lie, and the napkin that was about his head, not lying with the linen clothes, but wrapped together in a place by itself.
There are bloodstains on the shroud caused by wounds in the neck and the forehead. Similar bloodstains can be found on the Sudarium, and furthermore, they align exactly with those on the shroud. According to forensic scientists, these cloths must have been used on the same body. And since official documents held in Oviedo record the arrival of the Sudarium in Spain in 631 AD, the shroud has to be older than this, which makes it at least 700 years older than the age given by the radiocarbon test. There's even more evidence to link these two cloths. Analysis of the bloodstains on the shroud has shown them to be blood group AB. The stains on the sudarium are also of type AB. This is a rare blood group found in only 3% of the world's population, and so the chances of these two cloths having an AB blood group match is less than 1 in 1,000. Further analysis of the shroud bloodstains has revealed the presence of X and Y chromosomes, confirming that the blood was shed by a male. In addition, there's been shown to be an extraordinarily high bilirubin count in the bloodstains. Bilirubin is a breakdown product of hemoglobin, and such unusually high levels indicate extreme physical shock caused by severe stress or torture. Clearly this is consistent with the biblical description of the scourging and crucifixion of Jesus Christ. Although there aren't any records that tell us how the shroud came to be in France in 1353 AD, there are earlier historical documents which refer to a cloth containing an image of Christ. One of these is a 6th century chronicle which records that in 554 AD, a group of priests publicly paraded an image of Jesus not made by human hands. The image was impressed upon linen and was paraded throughout Cilicia and Cappadocia. This is significant because although many early representations of Jesus portrayed him as a youthful, clean-shaven man, the face of Christ became highly conventionalized in Byzantine art in the years following that public parade and began to show a striking resemblance to the face depicted in the shroud. In the 1930s, biologist Paul Vignon identified 20 peculiarities in the shroud face that are commonplace in Byzantine iconography. These include the beard slightly displaced to one side, the moustache not symmetrical, a hairless area between the lower lip and the beard, and one eye lower than the other. This close correlation of features provides clear evidence that Byzantine representations of Jesus were based upon the facial features of the shroud image. The icon of Christ Pantocrator in St. Catherine's Monastery at Sinai dates from the mid-6th century and so provides clear evidence that the shroud must have existed before that time. A bloodstained cloth is of course a kind of evidence that criminal pathologists work with every day. The shroud has been studied extensively by Robert Buckling, a forensic pathologist from Los Angeles County, who concluded that the evidence of a scourged man who was crucified and died of suffocation is clear-cut. The markings on his body are so clear and so medically accurate that they are, in my opinion, beyond dispute. There are bloodstains made by wounds in the hands and feet where the body was nailed to the cross, but these wounds are not where paintings of the crucifixion throughout the centuries have shown them to be. Artists have always depicted the nails penetrating the middle of the palms and the top of the feet. The wounds on the shroud, however, show that the nails were driven through the wrists, not the palms, and through the heels, not the feet. This was confirmed to be anatomically correct by a French physician named Pierre Barbet, who conducted a number of medical experiments in the 1930s, which showed that nails driven through the palms could not support the weight of a crucified body. Further confirmation came in 1968 with the discovery of the skeleton of a crucified man, the only skeletal evidence ever found for Roman crucifixion. One of the heel bones still had the nail used for crucifixion embedded within it, corresponding exactly with the position of the bloodstains on the shroud. The fact that the placement of nails shown in paintings of the crucifixion throughout history has been incorrect shows us that the actual method used by Romans to nail its victims to the cross had long been forgotten. The correct placement of these bloodstains on the shroud rules out the possibility of it being a medieval forgery and provides more evidence that it wrapped the body of a victim of crucifixion. And since this method of execution was abolished by Emperor Constantine in 337 AD, the shroud must have originated before that date, making it at least 1,000 years older than the radiocarbon dating result. Dr. Buckland's studies of the bloodstained shroud confirmed evidence of other wounds which not only match the biblical account of the crucifixion, but are also consistent with the weapons used by Roman soldiers. There are 120 scourge marks on the front, back and legs of the man of the shroud which matched the flagrum, a Roman whip which had 3 leather thongs, each having 2 lead or bone pellets designed to cut into the flesh. There are abrasions across the back above the shoulder blades, which are consistent with them having carried a heavy object such as the crossbeam which Jesus carried to the crucifixion site. The placing of a crown of thorns on the head was a torture unique to the crucifixion of Jesus, and there is evidence of this on the shroud, which shows bloodstains made by 15 puncture wounds all around the head. Finally, there is a bloodstain formed by a deep wound in the side, which archaeologists confirm matches the shape of excavated examples of the leaf-shaped point of the Roman lance. This once again ties in with the biblical description of a soldier piercing the side of Jesus. This forensic analysis provides compelling evidence that directly connects the shroud to the crucifixion of Jesus. One of the tests undertaken in the 1970s involved botanist Max Frey, a Swiss criminologist who developed a technique for tracing where criminals had been by testing samples of dust and pollen from their clothing. He extracted dust samples from the shroud using sticky tape, which he then examined using both optical and electron microscopes. He was able to identify 57 different species of plant from the pollen grains found in the dust samples. 17 of these species were from plants commonly found in Europe, but he also found pollen from several desert plants native to Israel but not found in France or Italy. These included grains of Gandelia terniforti, a species of prickly thorn. He also found pollen grains from plants found on the banks of the Bosphorus near Istanbul, which in medieval times was known as Constantinople. He concluded from these findings that the shroud had been in both Palestine and Constantinople before coming to France and Italy. The Constantinople connection ties in with the writings of a French knight named Robert de Clary, who was one of many crusaders camped outside Constantinople in the year 1204 AD. De Clary wrote that every Friday, a church in Constantinople displayed the shroud in which Jesus had been wrapped, and that one could see the full figure of our Lord upon it. A few months later, these same crusaders looted and destroyed many parts of the city, stealing treasures of gold, silver and ivory, as well as sacred relics, including the precious burial cloth of Jesus. There isn't any record of what happened to the shroud after it was taken, but many of these crusaders were French, and so it's entirely plausible that they brought it with them when they returned to France. This would certainly explain how pollen grains from plants native to Constantinople came to be found on the shroud. This botanical work was taken further by Dr. Alan and Mary Wanger, who applied a method of image comparison known as polarized image overlay technique to high-quality photographs of the shroud. They discovered faint images of flowers, leaves, buds, fruit and stems around the head and chest of the image, presumably from plants placed with the body when it was wrapped. Professor Avinoam Danin, a botanist from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, confirmed this research and identified one species as the beancaper Zygophyllum dimosum, which grows only in Israel, Jordan and Egypt's Sinai Desert. Other images found were from rock rose, which grows throughout the Middle East, and Gundelia tourneforti, which many Christians believe was used to make the crown of thorns. This was consistent with the findings of Dr. Yuri Baruch, an Israeli expert in pollen and plants, who discovered that a third of the pollen grains were from Zygophyllum dimosum, and also confirmed the presence of rock rose close to the left cheek. Professor Danin concluded that the area between Jerusalem and Hebron is the only place in the world where people could have gathered at least 4 of the plant species found on the shroud and placed them on the body. Also, 8 of the plants identified only flower in the months of March and April. The presence of floral images of these plants on the shroud suggests that they were picked in Jerusalem and placed on the body during March or April, which matches the time and place of the crucifixion of Jesus. Images of other objects can be found on the shroud. In 1980, Professor Francis Filas of Loyola University in Chicago and Michael Marks, an expert in classical coins, detected patterns on coins which had been placed over the eyes. The coin on the right eye appeared to be a lepton, a coin minted between 29 and 36 AD by Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of Judea, which depicts a staff circled by the words Tiberiu Caesaros. When viewing photographs of the shroud at high magnification, Filas identified the staff and the letters UCAI. This almost matched the lepton coin, but curiously the letter C was found where he expected to see a letter K. This misspelling initially undermined his findings until he found 2 lepton coins with exactly the same misspelling when examining the coin collection at the British Museum. This remarkable discovery once again places the shroud in Palestine at the time when Jesus was crucified. Scientists have also investigated minute quantities of dirt found on the shroud where it covered the nose, knees and heels. Dr. Joseph Kolbeck of the Hercules Aerospace Center in Utah and Riccardo Levi-Setti of the University of Chicago examined these embedded dirt particles taken from the shroud's surface. They found them to be a form of limestone known as travertine aragonite. This is not a commonly occurring form of limestone, but it is found in Jerusalem. Using a high-resolution microprobe, they compared the spectra of samples taken from the shroud with limestone from near the Damascus Gate of Jerusalem, close to the crucifixion site where Jesus would have walked. The chemical signatures of the shroud samples and the Jerusalem limestone were identical. This is highly significant because the trace chemical composition of the travertine aragonite limestone found in Jerusalem has so far proved to be unique, which means that the dirt on the shroud must have originated there. The areas of the shroud where the dirt was found, at the heels but also the nose and knees, are also significant as they're once again consistent with the Bible's accounts of Jesus carrying his cross to the crucifixion site and falling under its weight. There's one more aspect of the shroud that for me and many others confirms its authenticity. Many people have been deeply moved and affected after gazing at the image on the linen cloth. The impact it has is often so profound that it leaves an inner knowing, a rock-solid belief in the relic's authenticity which cannot be shaken, and scientific analysis of the image provides further justification for holding to this belief. It's been shown that this image wasn't created by paint, pigment, dyes or stains. This was proven by the Shroud of Turin project team after spending 3 years and over 150,000 man-hours studying the numerous samples, X-rays, visual and ultraviolet photographs which they brought back from Turin in 1978. These scientists showed that the image is in fact only on the very surface of the linen. The faint image that we see when viewing the shroud is due to discoloration of individual surface fibrils which are as thin as a human hair. In spite of their extensive study, they couldn't explain how the image was formed or its extraordinary and unique characteristics. For example, we've already seen that reversing the light and shade of the cloth reveals a clear, lifelike and high-resolution image of a man, an image which has an almost photographic quality. Even more remarkably, this image has been shown to have three-dimensional information encoded within it, so that when a photograph of the shroud is processed by a VP8 image analyzer, a device that converts light and dark areas of an image into vertical relief, it reveals an accurate three-dimensional representation of the human form. This is a unique result and quite unlike the distorted jumble of shapes seen when normal photographs or paintings are processed using this device. And Dr. Petrus Soons was able to take this even further. He discovered that the image on the shroud also contained holographic information, and with the help of colleagues he was able to create a hologram of the body in the shroud from the photographs of the image. There are no other historical artifacts that possess any of these characteristics, and despite all our scientific knowledge and years of study by believers and skeptics alike, we still don't know how the image was formed, and we still can't accurately reproduce it. Some scientists have been forced to conclude that the image was formed by a burst of radiation, such as Christ might have produced at the moment of resurrection. It's clear that these 12 separate studies completely undermine the contention that the Turin Shroud is a forgery from medieval Europe. Many of them prove that the shroud is much older than the result given by the radiocarbon test, whilst others show conclusively that the shroud had at some time been in Palestine. And several of these lines of evidence directly link this cloth to the biblical events which Christians commemorate each Easter. It's ironic that science, which for centuries has undermined religious teachings, is now providing evidence through studies of the Turin Shroud that supports a faith in the biblical account of Christ's torture, crucifixion and resurrection. Indeed, where the shroud is concerned, the roles of religion and science have been completely reversed, with those scientists who have studied it boldly stating their belief in the relic, while the Church backs away from endorsing its authenticity. But what about the main piece of evidence that undermines this belief? The radiocarbon dating conducted in 1988. There remains a general acceptance that the shroud is a forgery as a result of the publicity surrounding that test. But it has since been shown that the sample used for testing was taken from a corner of the cloth which had been repaired in 1532 AD. This repair followed a fire in the chapel where the shroud was stored, and which charred the cloth in several places. There's clear evidence that this repair was made using a highly skilled invisible mending technique known as French weaving, which patched new material into the edge of the shroud, leaving no visible trace of the repair. The sample taken for testing therefore contained original linen heavily contaminated with 16th century patch fabric, resulting in an inaccurate radiocarbon date, a perfect example of the type of unforeseen contamination which Eugenia Natovsky referred to at the beginning of this video. This was just one of several testing process failures in the radiocarbon test, which has generated widespread criticism within scientific circles. Indeed, one observer claimed that the carbon dating of the shroud will probably go down in history as one of the greatest fiascos in the history of science. I'll explore these topics further in my next video, which will detail the evidence that the radiocarbon sample was contaminated, as well as the reasons for the controversy surrounding the radiocarbon test.